Okay, we are live. Okay, Manisha, you can start. We are live. You're mute. Manisha, you're mute.
Yeah, just now. A very good evening and very happy new year to all of you. What a delight it is to start 2025 on such a high note in presence of a true legend, the one and only Dr. K. Elder. Today's session is not just an opportunity to listen to a pioneer, but to celebrate someone whose work has touched countless lives, both within and beyond the field of embryology. Dr. Elder's journey is nothing short of extraordinary, with academic achievements that includes degrees in biochemistry from University of St. Andrews, in molecular biology from University of Colorado Medical School, and a degree in medicine as well from prestigious Cambridge University. She represents a pinnacle of dedication to the science and humanity. Her association with iconic Bornholm Clinic began in 1984, where she joined as a clinical assistant to Dr. Patrick. But by 1987, her scientific expertise, her research background, and passion for research led her to IVF Clinic, where she started working alongside with Nobel laureate Dr. Bob Edward, contributing to groundbreaking advancements in field of reproductive medicine. Beyond her scientific achievements, Dr. Elder's commitment to education and mentoring shines brightly. As a director of continuing education, she trained countless professionals, shaping the future of embryology and assisted reproduction trainings worldwide. Her influence extends globally through her co-founding of ALPHA, the Society for Scientists in Reproductive Medicine, and as the author of 8 essential textbooks, which continue to guide embryology and assisted reproductive technique practitioners worldwide. Along with, she has the credit of publishing RBM online journal as well. She remains a beacon of innovation, compassion, and collaboration. Dr. Elder's story is one of the brilliance and humility, a life dedicated to learning, teaching, and making an indelible impact on countless lives. Dr. Elder's contributions are woven in the fabric of reproductive medicine. It's truly an honor to welcome the legendary Dr. K. Elder to this incredible session. Ma'am, we are truly privileged to have you here with us today. And we are eagerly looking forward to the wisdom and insight you will share through this stage. So to take this incredible conversation forward, I'm delighted to invite and introduce Dr. Rajvi Mehta ma'am, who will anchor today's discussion with Dr. Elder. Although Dr. Rajvi needs no introduction, she is a highly respected academician in the field of embryology and esteemed treasurer of Academy of Clinical Embryologists India, a pioneer in Indian ART field. She is the first in country to earn a PhD in reproductive medicine and a proud team member of the team responsible for the second IVF baby in country. Dr. Rajvi has been instrumental in shaping high standard of IVF practices in India through her work by mentoring a generation of embryologists, IVF practitioners. She has published, edited numerous publications, articles, chapters, journals. Beyond her scientific endeavor, she's author the thought-provoking book What If, reflecting her multifaceted personality, a mentor to many. She is admired not just for her vast experience, but also for her holistic approach, seamlessly integrating her Iyengar yoga training into her professional ethos. Her dedication to education, research, and balance make her an ideal person to lead today's conversation with Dr. Elder. So, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Manisha, for a very elaborate introduction. And thank you, Dr. K, for joining us. I know you don't really come on public forums as frequently. So it's really an honor and pleasure for all of the clinical embryologists in India. And we have a huge crop of young embryologists in India who are, who have literally grown up with your studying your books. So for them, it's really a pleasure to see you in person, and many of them were very excited to have you here. And we will directly move to the conversation. And as Manisha has introduced you, you surely have worked in a very diverse set of fields, starting as a clinician, a researcher, a embryologist, working as the editor, a deputy editor of a very, very prestigious journal, RBM Online, and then starting the Masters of Clinical Embryology courses, and now counseling people. So you have covered the entire gamut of IVF for over 4 decades. So the first thing, I would really like to ask you that when you've worked in various fields, can you show the connection of your this fantastic journey across the fields?
Well, as you know, first of all, Rajvi, I'm delighted to be here talking to you and to all of your colleagues in India. I love your country, as you know, and you and I have been friends for many, many, many years. It is always a pleasure to get in touch with you. So thank you very much for this kind invitation. And also thank you for the rather elaborate introduction. So your question is, how did this come about? Well, as you know, I grew up in Mexico, and we moved to Scotland in 1964. And I was fortunate to be allowed to attend St. Andrews University. By that time, I had already been working as a lab technician in a hospital lab, and I was fascinated with the science of biochemistry. So I decided to study biochemistry at the University of St. Andrews. That was my first grounding as a scientist. I was very, very lucky when I was there because as part of the degree, we have to do a thesis in our final year, and my supervisor happened to be a professor who was on sabbatical from the University of Colorado in the States. And when I was finishing my degree, in my fourth year, Dr. Priest, my supervisor, said, well, what are you going to do next year? And I said, well, I'm not really very sure, Dr. Priest. And he very kindly invited me to join him to go back to Colorado to do a PhD in his department. So that was my next transition. And I did my PhD in those days, it was called experimental pathology, but my actual research was on oncogenic viruses and RNA tumor viruses. This was in the early 1970s, before retroviruses had been discovered and become a big thing. But again, in virology, I found it fascinating. I think I'm just afflicted with curiosity. Once I start learning about something, I want to continue learning. So the combination of biochemistry and molecular biology, of course, it's fascinating learning about life and the physiology that keeps human beings alive and healthy. The next stage was I was fortunate to get a postdoctoral position at the Imperial Cancer Research Fund in London. And I was working there again with the oncogenic viruses, with RNA tumor viruses, with how viruses cause cancer and the molecular biology in that. And it was a lovely place to work, and I loved it. But unfortunately, my father was afflicted with very serious cancer, and I took time off to look after him. And I realized that when I was nursing my father with terminal cancer, that what he was suffering really was not related to what I theoretically had been studying in cancer research. I couldn't see the connection between, although obviously I appreciated that the basis underlying cancer and what makes cells transform into malignant cells is very important. I couldn't see a real connection between that and the suffering that my father was undergoing. So this prompted me to think about studying medicine. Because for that specific reason, I wanted to be able to make the connection between the cell biology, the molecular biology, the biochemistry, and how it actually affects the human being and in health. And again, I was extremely lucky. I applied to the Fuchs Foundation, which is a foundation that was established in 1976 by a wonderful philanthropist, Sir Ernest Fuchs, who's I know you've worked in laboratories a long time, so you will recognize the MSC centrifuge, one of the early centrifuges that we always used to find in the laboratory. So Sir Ernest Fuchs was the person behind the MSC centrifuge, and he decided to establish a foundation specifically to encourage and promote collaboration between medicine and science, which of course is exactly what I was looking for at that time. So I was very lucky. I applied to the Fuchs Foundation and they gave me a scholarship in 1978, which then allowed me to study medicine. And that's how it came about.
So it's so fascinating. Today there's a lot of talk of integrative medicine, multidisciplinary approach, and you actually had it. And to see the real sense of, science being applied. Of course, there is great value in basic science to understand, but at some point we want to see it helping humankind. And I sort of connect with it to a great extent.
Yes,
So
into translation is what's needed, and that's really what I was interested in. I loved the cell biology, the molecular biology, but I want to see it translated into how it affects health and life.
And I think a very strong message goes to our younger generations. Like today, there is a lot of thought that one should have a goal and you should plan stuff, which is very good. But then life doesn't essentially go with plan. And the fact that you shared this, that you started with something, you went on to do something, but the commonality was you loved whatever you're doing and you found it very interesting. So I think that's a very strong message because a lot of young people join in and they're not really sure, you know. So
Yeah.
I think that's
the other thing is that I never turn down opportunities to learn something and to do something new. I think it's always a good idea to keep an open mind and be open to different possibilities.
So that's the making of a true scientist.
Yeah, because I could have continued in biochemistry. I could have become head of a biochem lab. I could have continued in cancer research. Practicing medicine was too scary for me. I wouldn't have been a very good practicing clinician. My plan in studying medicine was to go into oncology, to have them to understand the translation between cancer research and applied medicine in oncology.
So how did you land up in
that plan? Life got in the way, and I wasn't able to follow that plan.
So when you went into creation,
yes, but
how did you land up under Dr. Steptoe?
That was a complete accident. It was a phone call out of the blue.
Okay.
I don't know. I am a fatalist. I am, in fact, a fatalist. I think some things are meant to be if you are open to opportunities that are offered to you. So, but what happened was when I'd finished my medical degree, by that time I had a little boy, Robbie, who was born when I was a medical student. And unfortunately, when in my early years of training, when in those days, in 1980, 79, 80, you had to, it was it was physically very difficult to be a young doctor. You had to be working for 80 to 120 hours a week. You had to work every other night and every other weekend and be on call. And really, it was almost impossible to take care of my little boy at the same time, especially because he had some health issues. So I decided that I couldn't do it, and I dropped out of medicine. And everyone told me, you can't do that, you can't do that, you'll never get back in, it's impossible. And I said, I know, but I don't see an option. My priority is to take care of my family. They're very precious to me. And of course, I then had my little girl, Bethany, whom I think you've met. And I did various other part-time things that allowed me, but nothing to do with medicine or science. I did some writing, I did some catering, I taught music in the school, and I looked after somebody else's baby. I did all kinds of other things for a couple of years that would allow me to be at home with my children. And then I got a phone call out of the blue. I was sitting on the floor reading stories to Robbie and Bethany. It was 1984. So Robbie was 4 years old, and Bethany was one and a half. And I got a phone call from a friend at the medical school, and she knew why I had dropped out of medicine. And she said, Patrick Steptoe at Bournehall Clinic is very desperate for a locum. And she said, there's no on-call. You don't have to work at nights. Would you help him just for a week? And Bournehall was located very close to where I was living at the time. So I got somebody to take care of my children for a week. And I went out to Bournehall, and I just fell in love with the place. It's such a wonderful, wonderful place. And Patrick Steptoe, very kindly, he created a part-time job for me. Because in those days, women doctors could not work part-time. The part-time possibilities didn't exist. Nowadays, there are job sharing, and there, you can do all kinds of things nowadays, and the routine is very different. But in those days, it was all very rigid and very strict. So at the end of the week, Patrick, he actually created a job that would allow me to work and take care of my children. So that was a stroke of amazing good fortune. And of course, I loved working there.
So it's very interesting. It all appears like fate, destiny that got you there. And when you joined, I think there must have been a crazy rush from across the world for IVF because, it's just 4 or 5 years that. So what was the atmosphere? I mean, were they really in an elated state or was the workload very heavy? I relate that because I joined Mumbai, the first IVF or scientifically documented IVF baby in India, just a few months after the baby was born. And it was real chaotic, hundreds of people in the OPD, and I had nothing to do with the clinical side. So I can well imagine the first in the world for the crowd. So how was it because you also didn't belong to the field at all.
No, that's right. No.
How was it working with the giant?
It was, well, it was amazing. Actually, we were very, very busy. In those days, as you will remember, IVF was quite different. The eggs were recovered by laparoscopy. The patients had to stay in the hospital. It was very intensive. It was very serious. So the patients were inpatients for a week to 10 days. And we were very busy. There was a very long waiting list. The ward was always full. And Mr. Steptoe used to do a formal ward round every day. He knew every single patient. And as his junior doctor, as his clinical assistant, all of the doctors were expected to know everything about every patient that was on the ward. And we saw them every day and we spoke to them every day. But the atmosphere was wonderful. Everyone was very positive, and the patients, they they knew that it was difficult. Nothing was taken for granted. They knew that they would be very, very lucky if they had a child, but they worshipped Mr. Steptoe. They just knew that if it was possible, this man was going to give them a baby, and it was a wonderful positive atmosphere. All the nurses, and we were like a family, really. This was in the early 1980s. Of course, it all changed after Mr. Steptoe died, and then everything started to change. Yeah.
We've all read about the first Louis Brown, where Edwards contacted Dr. Steptoe, and his clinic was about 300 miles away, and then the fluids were got back. Just to relate, in Mumbai, we were the hospital was different from the research center, but it was just 300 meters, and it was quite a thing to carry the thermocol boxes with the saline bags with the follicular fluids. So did
Wow.
they? I mean, I'm sure you would have had some interaction about this massive distance to travel with the fluids. I mean, today you're talking a few seconds in which you want to screen the fluids, and here it was hours.
Yeah.
Some
No, but what they were doing in Oldham was Patrick would organize a group of patients ready for laparoscopy, and then Bob and his assistant Jean Purdy would load everything into a van. They took all the test tubes, the culture media, their microscopes, everything, and they drove up to Oldham, and then they stayed there during the egg recoveries to do the IVF until after the embryo transfer, and then they drove back home again. So they were
so they had a portable lab created in Oldham where they screened and grew the embryos to day 2, transferred, and then came back.
Then they came back, yeah. Yeah,
Oh.
and then eventually after a few years, they set up a little primitive lab there and started doing more there, but they still traveled back and forth. Patrick had to organize a group of patients, and they would travel up.
So it's something like the batch IVF that we did in India, where we didn't have enough embryologists. So they went there and did the cases and came back. And I mean, now think of the labs today and the lab at that time. It doesn't even seem like a lab.
No.
It was in the OT that sort of primitive lab was created.
That's
so
right.
It still worked, maybe not as good as today. What do you think was what was that thing which made things work? What the criticality, or what do you think about Edwards and Purdy and the team?
No, it was such a long and complicated story, Raj. As you know, it took them 10 years. It took them 10 years, and they had to change and try so many things. And it was very difficult. They had to, everything that we now take for granted, everything, from the beginning, from the stimulation to the monitoring, to the timing of HCG, to how to collect the eggs, how to suck them out, how to put them into culture, how to make the medium. They had to invent it from scratch. They had to work it out from scratch. So many different things. Everything that we now know is a part of doing an IVF cycle. They had to imagine it, they had to invent it, and it took them several trials before they could figure out. They changed the stimulation over and over and over again. They changed the culture medium every time. They tried all kinds of different things. They changed the timing, they changed the dose of HCG, the luteal support. But their final breakthrough didn't come. Okay, and remember, everything was very difficult in those days. They didn't have all the technology that we now have for assays. Everything, they had to do everything themselves by hand. Even just getting the estrogen and LH results. They couldn't just, go to a lab next door and get it immediately. No. So they needed to figure out how to get the egg at exactly the right time so that it was ready for ovulation. That really involved a lot of thinking, a lot of ingenuity, really, a lot of studying of the endocrinology, and the breakthrough they were very worried that the drugs they were using was having a bad effect on the endometrium, so that the embryos couldn't implant, because they were often getting a lot of embryos, but they didn't implant. So because they were worried about the drugs affecting the endometrium, they wanted to try just doing a natural cycle, which is very difficult, because how do you know, without the sophisticated monitoring that we have nowadays, how would you know when exactly to recover the egg? And they were able to do this when a rapid LH assay became available in 1977. It was a Japanese firm developed this rapid immunoassay. It's called the Hygonavis test. I don't know if you used it in India in those days, but it was a rapid test to measure LH levels. And so what they did was the patients had to collect urine samples every 3 hours, day and night, and they measured the LH in these urine samples, looking for the beginning of the LH surge, because as you know, the peak of the LH surge indicates when the egg is going to be ovulated. So that's what they did. They monitored the LH surge using this little kit. The patients had to give urine samples every 3 hours, day and night. And Jean did the assays, you know, even during the night. And as soon as they detected the surge, then they could time the operation. And it's incredible, but Leslie Brown, who's the mother of Louise, she was the second patient that they tried this natural cycle system. The second patient, and this was in May 1977. And so they collected one beautiful ripe egg. They fertilized it. They had one embryo, and the rest is history. We know that it worked. So they continued doing this from 1970. From that day onward, they continued doing only natural cycle IVFs, using no drugs, no luteal support, nothing. But you can imagine how hard it was if the LH, if they could miss the LH and miss the egg, or sometimes they had to do the laparoscopy in the middle of the night. So it was not easy, but they continued to do that. And after Leslie became pregnant, they in fact had 3 more pregnancies between May 77 and May 78. The second one was Alistair, whose mother, Grace. He was born in January 1979. So Grace was the third person to become pregnant. The other 2, unfortunately, one miscarried at 13 weeks, and the other one, very sadly, was a stillbirth. It was a normal boy, but he was born prematurely at, I think it was about 25 weeks or something like that, but it was a normal boy. So, but it was, you know, it was a long and very arduous journey to figure everything out. And then, of course, after Louise was born and after Alistair was born, they wanted to continue, but step 2 was already 65 years old. And the whole thing was so controversial. It was so scandalous that the hospital in Oldham didn't want them to continue. And so step 2 retired from the NHS. And the only way they applied, they wanted to continue doing it in Cambridge. They wanted to, you know, establish an NHS IVF clinic. They wanted to treat patients in Cambridge, but they couldn't get funding. Nobody would support them. It was too controversial, too scandalous. And the only option that they had was to open a private clinic themselves. But they didn't have any money. They didn't make a lot of money. Bob had a university position and a wife and 5 lovely daughters. So they got a financial advisor to raise enough capital venture funding to enable them to open a private IVF clinic at Bourne Hall. But it took them 2 years. 2 years they didn't do any IVF. They did nothing.
Oh.
Yeah.
10 years of failure can
Yeah.
dishearten anybody. I mean, so how did they take it? I mean, how did one persevere? Because here, even when people are working and the pregnancies don't occur, also to get patients, because it was not a treatment that was acceptable. So it's not like, patients would come in numbers. So anything like what kept them so motivated? Because it can be quite disheartening even in a year.
It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, they were
Yeah,
just
I mean,
they believed very strongly in what they were doing. But it would never happen nowadays because this was not their real job. They were doing it mostly in their own time, out of hours, and they just persevered. They believed in it. They had the courage of their convictions. Extraordinary.
so now coming back to you, you started under Steptoe as a clinical assistant. And how did you land up in the embryology lab? Were you, as clinicians, permitted to walk into the lab in Bourne
Oh my
Hall?
goodness. No, absolutely forbidden. No, no.
Okay.
No
So clinicians were not allowed into the embryology
clinicians
lab.
are not allowed in the IVF lab. Absolutely no way. No, and even though I said that I was a scientist, they didn't.
You had spent so many years in the labs and working with cell lines, but even then the doors were closed to you.
Absolutely closed. Absolutely closed. No, what happened was when Patrick died in March 1988, and then all the experienced clinicians who had been working with him left to start their own IVF units, and they took the experienced embryologists with them.
Okay.
So after Patrick died, the Bourne Hall was left with very few people with real training. Okay. And in fact, we were called to a meeting at the end of July in 1988, and we were told that the clinic was bankrupt and it was going to close and be turned into a nursing home.
Oh, okay.
So, and then another really incredible long story started when a particular very, very strong lady by the name of Bridget Mason, who had started an IVF clinic in London, she came out to Bourne Hall and spent the weekend looking around, and she decided that she wasn't going to let this happen. And she persuaded Serono to rescue Bourne Hall, to buy it and rescue it from and maintain it as an IVF clinic. Of course, Serono had a vested interest in this because they could use it to market the drugs that they were making. So that was the next era of Bourne Hall. But it did, that was when I was finally allowed to enter the IVF lab, because Bridget insisted on seeing everyone's CVs. And when she saw my CV, she said to me, well, why aren't you in the IVF lab? And I said, well, they won't let me because I'm a doctor. And she said, get in there. So I was sent in, and that was when I started working in the IVF lab. And of course, as a scientist, I was fascinated, absolutely fascinated. Yeah, I loved it.
Yeah, I remember the times, because even in India, we had Peter Brinston coming down, Serono's interest and stuff like that. So this was a totally different phase of Bourne Hall. And you sort of realize that Professor Edwards definitely did not have it easy. The lab stuff was difficult, and then the scandalous approach, and then running out of funds. And, but the way he came across was always very positive. At least I met him much later in life, sometime in the late 80s and 90s.
Always, no, Bob was never short of enthusiasm. Always, always, always. Amazing amount of energy. I mean, just incredible. Always positive, enthusiastic, and about everything. He could talk to anybody about anything, any subject. Yeah.
I do remember that because once I visited Cambridge and he was, why do you want to meet me? And Dr. Anand Kumar said, you're going there, just drop in. And I imagine dropping in,
Yeah.
to meet the Bob Edwards. Of course, he was already the Bob Edwards, in late 90s. And
Yeah.
when I called him, he says, why do you want to come? I said, I just want to say hello. And okay, I'll give you 5 minutes. And it was the RBM online office, in the,
Yeah.
and
In farm.
yeah, in the farm area.
Yeah.
And we were talking for 1 hour about everything under the sun except
Every,
embryology.
yes. Every under the
Uh,
sun.
and and he was fascinating. You could talk about culture and romanticize things. So he was a
Absolutely.
very unique personality.
Absolutely incredible. And you're definitely right. Unique.
So
Um,
now, when you were not allowed into the lab, and I sort of, you were not one of the accepted ones because you were a clinician, despite a. So, moment you went in, what was his reaction and interaction with you? Because it was not his choice, but Bridget who asked you to go in. So,
Bridget,
and he needed the funds,
yeah,
so he obviously had to
yeah.
accept.
By that time, the people that were in the lab had been okay. In the first few years, we had the embryologists like Jacques Cohen and Simon Fischel and Carol Fakili, who were the scientists, the embryologists, and then we had technicians who were their assistants. So mainly they wrote down and did the, prepared the dishes and things like that, but they didn't handle the actual gametes. The embryologists did those. But then when all the embryologists left, the only people that were left in the lab were the technicians, and one or two other embryologists were hired from elsewhere, but they didn't have experience in human IVF. They had experience in animal IVF. And when I started, I drove everybody crazy because I kept asking questions. I said, why do you do it like that? And what happens if you do it like that? And I just kept asking questions, and I was so unpopular, Rajvi, you can't imagine. They really hated it. It took me a really, really long time to eventually figure out that the reason I wasn't getting any answers is because nobody knew the answers. And I had to start learning for myself. By that time, Bob wasn't in the lab very much. He was very busy starting Esri and human reproduction and traveling around. You know how important it was starting Esri and starting the journals, etc. So he wasn't really involved in the actual running of the IVF lab very much. And I just read everything I could. I read every paper I could find, and I'm just afflicted with curiosity. I wanted to learn. And then Serono decided that we should start running workshops. Of course, again, it's in Serono's interest to promote the drugs, the fertility drugs that they were selling. So Bob started the first the first workshop. It was called, what was it called? It was called a Foundation Course in Assisted Reproductive Technology. Yeah.
Okay.
So that was September 1989. Because I spoke both languages, the clinicians and the scientist, I was asked to help Bob. And after he did the first one, he didn't want to do it anymore. So I was appointed to start organizing teaching courses, basically, and that's what I wound up doing from 1989 onwards.
Yes. So many of these students here, I mean, I know there's Nishad and a couple of others who have been your students. So, you drifted or shifted from the clinician to the embryologist to then the teacher, and it was not just teaching, you designed the courses, and possibly these were the first in the world, I think, or was Monash already there, or you were possibly the first to start these, the masters in clinical embryology, or
I can't remember when Monash started.
I think it was later.
Yeah.
Because there were only
No, okay.
So,
I have a few slides that I
sure,
could, which
you can share.
summarizes
Okay, you
if
can
I
share the screen. Sure.
screen, let me see. It tells the story better than I would be able to, I think. Okay. Uh, I don't know if I can find it.
Oh,
I have it on my desktop, but I need to find it on my desktop.
uh-huh.
Okay, that's better. Yes, I have it now. Okay, now if I can share.
Yeah, can you share? You can share screen.
I'm trying. Okay, no. I have the slides in front of me, and it has.
Oh, you just need to go to share screen, and or you can just
I've gone to share.
uh-huh. Or if you can just
It won't let me see. Send a copy to.
yeah, or you can send me a copy and I can share it.
Sending it to you, I think.
Okay. You can email it or
I didn't think it was good.
WhatsApp it. Oh, okay.
So complicated. But here it goes.
It's coming. Okay. So after hearing about all these years of problems, this means nothing.
Well, what happened? I'll tell you what happens before.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah. For the slides. What happened was when I started teaching these workshops, they were mostly doctors, obviously, because they were sponsored by Serono, and that's only doctors write prescriptions. So
Okay.
okay. So they're not going to sponsor people who are not going to be buying the drugs, are they? So they were
The
mostly
story seems pretty similar now.
So there were mostly doctors who came on these workshops. It started in 1989, and we had more and more and more because they were very popular. And I did a lot of the teaching. We had practical sessions as well. But it became very obvious to me that the doctors all thought that all you needed in order to do the lab side of IVF was someone who could use a microscope. Okay. And it just became very clear to me that this wasn't right. There was a lot more to the science of IVF, and that we needed a structured scientific training for how to do the lab side of IVF, and not just concentrate on the clinicians. So I started trying to run workshops for scientists, but it was hard for them to get funding because they don't write prescriptions. And we were only doing 1 week courses, which I realized was that, you can't learn how to do the science of IVF in 1 week. So that was when the idea of starting Alpha began, as you remember.
Yeah.
The beginnings of Alpha. I think that was where we first met.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So Alpha was possibly a big turning point with all the embryologists. I think it was you and Yona and Cohen, Jacques, and So can
Yeah.
you elaborate how this came about? Because, we are talking of a time where internet was barely existent.
Barely existing. That's right. Yes.
So to
It was
connect with people,
yeah,
to base.
it was 1994. So by that time, I had been teaching at Bourne Hall for almost 5 years, and we got together with people that you just mentioned, like Jack Cohen, and Yona was a little bit later. But anyway, we started thinking we really need a structured training for the science of IVF, and we proposed to start a group for scientists in reproductive medicine. And by that time, there were in a few other countries, people had started to organize groups for IVF, for lab IVF. The first one was in France, in fact, in 1986, they started BLEFCO. And then in 1993 in Holland, they started the Dutch Embryology Society. And also in the UK and in Spain. So little initial groups of embryologists had started to form. So the way we went about it is my son Robbie is an IT expert genius, and even when he was very young, at that time he was 14 years old. But he took all the lists of people that had come to the workshops in Bourne Hall. By that time, 5 years, quite a few, and he created a database for me. And then we didn't have email or the internet in those days. Well, the internet was just beginning, but we didn't have email. But we sent out information about a new society for scientists and in embryologists. We sent this to all the people who had come to courses in IVF. And then I met a young man called Thomas Elliott. Do you remember Thomas?
Yes, very well.
Yeah. So that was a real stroke of fortune, because Thomas was in the days of the initial internet. Thomas was right in there, and he was a genius. So he became very, very important. So Robbie created the database, and Thomas started us with a website and with trying to put things on the internet, etc. And that's how it began. But we decided to produce a newsletter. And in fact, it was Robbie who did the beautiful formatting. I edited the articles, and then Robbie helped me produce it into a newsletter.
So it was all in-house.
All in my house, yes, all in my house, yeah.
Interesting. I remember the designs were brilliant.
And everything had to be sent by post. So Bethany helped us with putting all the newsletters into envelopes as well.
Well,
yeah.
What was interesting would be that, was there any kind of resistance from the clinicians when the scientists got together, or reproductive biologist or embryologist, as one was called? Was there any resistance or questioning by the clinical fraternity or the others?
There were very separate camps in those days, as you probably remember. Yeah.
Yes.
I think it took a very, very long time. It took a number of years before people gradually realized and accepted that actually the lab side of IVF is very, very important. It's crucial. It took a long time.
Because we didn't even have a term of embryologist. I mean, we were called reproductive scientists, reproductive biologists, and therefore Alpha has no name as clinical embryologist.
That's right. That's right. It didn't exist.
It didn't exist.
It didn't exist. We had to create a new discipline called.
So whose idea was it? I mean, which group of people? Sometimes it's not just one individual who created this term, clinical embryologists. Because I remember, when the term came in the late 90s, and Dr. Anand Kumar was furious, saying, what is this clinical embryology? You people do work for 3 days or 3 days, day 3 embryos, and embryology is so vast. So I would argue that it's clinical embryologist, we are handling things which is going to determine. So I was
That's
just
right.
curious to know if where did this term come about?
It gradually emerged through the newsletters, through the production of
Okay.
newsletters, because we did them the first one was 94, and we continued to do them until 2001. So, and they were translated into Spanish, Italian, and Turkish. So they had a very big circulation. And then, yeah, because in those days, as you just said, the people who did the lab IVF they were called different things in different countries. And in some countries, it was very often the clinician who also did the lab side. He did both in small units. And we had embryology itself is completely different. It's a medical discipline. It's study of, and that goes into fetal medicine. So I think it just gradually came about through ALPHA, through the newsletter, that we decided on clinical embryology. I don't think there was any active decision. It just
Also, the online conferences, and we are talking where we barely, we would type out, I think it was a non-stop 48 hours or 3 days across time zones. And I think those were one of the most fascinating, and to believe that what is chat today, there were so many people chatting simultaneously. And there were Patrick Quinn, and possibly that's a time which was very easy for us, people who were in those so-called developing third world countries, where we could interact with ease without going to conferences. Because
That's
late
right.
90s.
Yeah.
So I think those were possibly Thomas Elliott's contribution as the IVF.net and stuff before he went into acting.
It was Thomas who was able to make it happen. Thomas and Robbie together put the technology together. And so we spent some time preparing. We would decide on a topic and then communicate with various different people all over the world to tell them about it, and to ask different people to perhaps, if you remember, we had sort of different topics spoken about it, and sort of a leader in each area. Yeah, so what happened was Thomas came to my house, and we basically set it up over 72 hours, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, and people could join in from all over the world. As you said, Patrick from California and Alan Trask from Australia. And it was very exciting to hear from all these people who were very seriously interested in the science of IVF and had been trying lots of different things. And everyone was able to share their experience about specific topics.
So for the people who are not familiar with this, we used to have once or twice a year internet-based conference going on 24 hours a day for 72 hours non-stop. And people from different time zones would come and interact. And there were people who were there, possibly not sleeping right through the night, chatting through. And Kay actually took the entire initiative of transcribing all these chats and putting them into structured, which became books for troubleshooting, ICSI, micromanipulation, and a range of topics. And many of these, even the troubleshooting book, a lot of it even holds good today, because these were very informal interactions which gave us a lot of insight on the practices that were happening across the world. And it gave a lot of confidence to people who are working in some remote areas where we didn't have much interaction, to know we were on the right track, or what modifications, ask questions, because we didn't have people. So I think they were a big thing, these alpha conferences that were held.
Yeah.
When alpha got very structured after that, first few years. So was there a transition?
We need to clarify about these conferences. Of course, we didn't have the video technology in those days. Yes. People were only writing. They were chatting. They were writing. So there was no speech and there was no video. It was all transcribed. It was all written. And so at the end of the 72 hours, I would take the entire transcript of everything that everyone had written about the different subjects, and then cut and paste and cut and paste and cut and paste into a more or less coherent text about the different subjects. And then Phil Matson in Australia had a little publishing company, and he published the books as hard copies. Yeah.
So, Vance from Alpha, and then you have been a prolific writer. And I think a lot of the younger generation has grown up reading your books. So, what would you like to say? I mean, all the textbooks that you have written, which are possibly a great reference tool, especially when we started, there were no books. I think there was only one book by Edwards, written in 85. That was the only textbook, which came many years later. Otherwise, we only had the research papers. So what drove you to writing these textbooks from range of topics to microbiology and IVF to, all the basic books?
Well, the first one I wrote was because I wanted to learn. I wanted to know, okay? I had to know. So that was about 1989, 1990. It was when I started teaching. You can't teach something unless you learn and understand it yourself. So that was what prompted me to write the first edition of the IVF book. And I know, just endless curiosity, really. I wrote them because, first of all, because I wanted to know, and secondly, because I thought there was a need for other people to be able to learn, to be able to get the information, because as you remember, it wasn't easy to get information in those days. We didn't have
closed.
We didn't have the Google and the internet and everything that brings everything to you. In fact, when I did the last edition, the fourth edition, if any keyword that you type into Google, you get so much information, it's just ridiculous. And you don't know where to start because a lot of it's rubbish. So I decided I'm not doing this anymore. Yeah. So yeah, no, they were.
I think
the first two editions were written without the help of the internet, and
I think at that point, the problem was lack of information. So we struggled to get information. Today, there is an overload of information. So we work to discerning that information to find, something worthwhile from all, like you say, a lot of rubbish that comes in.
That's right.
Just now, Joy has been released, and just 2 months, and you have seen all the characters. You've seen Jeopardy. You have worked with Steptoe. You worked with Edwards. And obviously, you've met Louis Brown multi numbers of times. And, so anything, is the movie a real version or a dramatized version or with a lot of creative liberty?
There's a lot of creative liberty, a lot of creative liberty. Yes, yeah.
Some insights from the real story to the film story.
Well, first of all, Jean Purdy herself, I think, would have been mortified at the way that she was portrayed, because she was a very quiet, a very private person. She was very, very dedicated. She worked very hard, and of course, her role was very important. She kept meticulous notes, and I think it would have been very difficult for them to figure out what was going wrong and what to do next without all of Jean's help. She was very, very well organized, and she organized everything. She organized everything in the lab, and so it was they were able to look at their results and see what was working and what wasn't because of the work that Jean was doing. But she was a very quiet, very private person, and she certainly would have been. All the bit about her gynae history is just made up. I mean, that's just invented. Maybe she had endometriosis, but if she did, she wouldn't have known about it in those days. Even now it's difficult to diagnose, and in those days it was impossible. And the only way she would have known, we shouldn't really talk about this, but the bit her being infertile is rubbish. I mean, she, you know, the only way you know you're infertile is if you're trying to get pregnant, and she wasn't. We didn't do that in the 1960s. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It just happens. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a little dramatized version,
Absolutely.
but to
Version.
appeal to
Yeah.
the
And
modern audience.
they put a lot of modern day perspectives into the 1960s, which just didn't exist. But you know, it's a good movie. A lot of people really like it, and I think the overall message has got across, even though some of it's
It's a little dramatized.
romanticized.
Yeah. Okay, now we've been speaking for nearly an hour. And, we have a lot of young embryologists in India. The last 3 years, we have about 25 to 30 universities. So we're going to have a huge crop of very enthusiastic budding embryologists whose situation now is very different from our times in the 80s and 90s. So what kind of advice and guidance? I mean, what you have said all this time, getting totally enjoying what you do, the quest for learning which continues, the multidisciplinary approach. You've given a lot of hints, and the passion. You've given multiple hints through talks. But any direct message to the embryologist community of how they should pursue this subject, or how you see people pursuing the subject now?
Okay. Well, first of all, don't do it unless you seriously love it and are interested in what you're doing. Because if you don't have that kind of motivation, it's very easy to do it badly. You have to pay a lot of attention to detail, to every detail. And if you're not that interested, you probably won't give the attention that it needs. There are many different facets to it, of course. I mean, for example, I could not do ICSI to save my life. I wouldn't even try to, because I have a terrible three-dimensional perspective. I can't do it. I can't even park a car. It's ridiculous. So when I tried to learn how to do ICSI, I realized immediately that I couldn't see it. I couldn't do it. But now, youngsters nowadays have so much training in video games and doing all, remote everything, which I didn't have when I was young, that they will find it much easier. But you have to be interested. You have to enjoy. You have to appreciate that what you're doing is making such a huge difference to somebody's life. I mean, really, really life-changing, giving somebody a baby. And you have to view it from that perspective. It's very precious. It's a very precious thing. You must take great care with everything that you do and not take anything for granted. Because as you know, there are so many steps. I think Rusty Poole counted something like 150 different steps that you have to take, the parameters in the lab side of IVF. That's something in the region of at least 150 different parameters that you must be all correct and carefully orchestrated at the right time for successful IVF. So you mustn't take it as just a recipe to be followed. You must question what you're doing and make sure that you're doing it correctly.
Okay. So you're giving the message that it's not just the skill, but the detail, the involvement, all the steps, etc. One last question is, we had IVF, then we had this ICSI coming in, we had a chatter, color bonnet, and surely male infertility is on the rise, and the demand for ICSI is very, very high because we're having such high numbers of people with oligospermia and even azoospermia. I mean, male infertility is on the rise.
Yeah.
What would you say is the role of conventional IVF? There are, like the Americans, I mean, I'm talking without any hard data, but there's a more tendency for invasive techniques. So what do you think is the role of conventional IVF? How important is it according to you, or not important?
What conventional IVF?
I mean,
As
what we did, eggs and sperms and the
sorry,
fertilization happened.
you're breaking up a little bit. It's not
Oh,
very.
what I was referring to is what the simple steps of keeping the eggs with the cumulus, adding the sperms, and letting IVF happen,
Yeah,
rather than injecting a sperm when there is no male factor. So the
yeah,
arguments are that, we are sure of fertilization. What if there's a fertilization failure? So we should be doing ICSI.
yeah,
While, what's your view on that? So in non-male factor, and there are quite a few cases, at least 40-50%, which are non-male factor.
yeah. I know. I
Your
know.
take on it?
No, I know that there are many, many clinics all over the world where they do exclusively ICSI, because it's too traumatic to explain to the patient that fertilization has failed, and why should you take that risk, because you can just do ICSI instead. At Bourne Hall, we still do IVF because we've always done IVF, and we have embryologists who have a lot of experience in doing IVF, and it's becoming more and more difficult to discern who are the patients who actually should have ICSI. We have protocols, etc. But I as a scientist, as a molecular biologist, ICSI shouldn't work. I mean, it really shouldn't. It's what you're doing to the egg is outrageous, and the fact that it does work is completely miraculous to me. But I still think there's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot that we don't know in terms of epigenetic effects.
Mhm. Sure.
Yeah. Now, you as a microbiologist, Rajvi, I should tell you the reason why I wrote that infections book,
Okay.
because when ICSI was introduced in 1992, around about the same time, there were quite a few patients with HIV,
Right.
who were HIV carriers,
Mhm.
and I knew that there was a lot of discussion and debate about the possibility of offering ICSI for patients who were HIV carriers. And because I had a background in oncogenic viruses and
Mhm.
retroviruses, oh, you can't do that. You can't
Yeah.
do that. You cannot do that. The possibility, you don't know what you're doing if you're injecting a retrovirus into the nucleus of an egg, really. And I was so alarmed, and I realized that in the IVF community, you are the one exception. Most people don't know anything about microbiology, really. It just
Mhm.
and so that inspired me to write the infections book, because I think it's very important that people should realize the risks that can be taken by introducing infection into the IVF. But to answer your question directly, I don't know. I mean, there's so many things I still don't know. Epigenetics is certainly a growing concern at the moment. And, a lot of questions about whether the media that we're using should be improved, can be improved we need to find out a lot more about what we're doing. Yeah.
It's nice to know, to hear from you, who is considered as one of the master teachers, having possibly the first teachers in formal academic courses on IVF, actually say there's so much to learn. So I think that's a big message, that getting a degree is possibly the beginning, and that
Oh,
starts the journey.
yes, it's
Yeah.
only the very beginning. Yes.
Yeah. So I thank you, Kay. It was wonderful talking to you. I'm sure we both can keep chatting for hours together.
Yeah.
I would now, over to you, Manisha. And if there are one or two questions or thoughts from the audience, if it's okay with you, Kay, another 10 minutes, 5 minutes, we
Yes,
can
yes, of course. Yeah, no
take it.
problem. Yep, of
Yeah,
course.
you can unmute yourself and
Ah, Ma'am, as such, what an incredible session this has been. A perfect blend of knowledge, inspiration, positivity, hope, perseverance, and meaningful discussion. As of now, I can't see much questions in the chat box because probably in your comprehensive discussion, you have covered most of the queries about all these things. But people are keen to know whether these initial resources in which you have documented and those journals which has been written down after those meetings, are they still available? Can we get those?
Oh, the internet conferences, no.
Yes,
No.
yes. No.
I think if I may have the soft copy of the troubleshooting,
Oh, lovely.
that was, I don't know, long back we had reprinted it in India. Okay, you remember?
That's of
With
course.
Mark Wenderberg and
Yeah, you reprinted it, yes. And then after that, I wrote the troubleshooting book for
okay.
Cambridge University Press, yeah. But
Okay.
no, everything that happened in Oldham, that was published in a series of 6 papers in IBM Online. That was published in 2015. So all of that data, everything that they tried to do and all the different things that they tried to do, that's all written down and published in 2015. The internet books, no, Phil printed a certain number and then they were gone, within a month of their being produced. They were a very sort of informal, non-commercial. They were, it was just they were purely done for for information sharing to help embryologists, really. But the rest of the internet conferences, I have one copy of each one.
Oh, lovely. Those archives are really, really important and precious to us. Ma'am, one more doctor wanted to know if you can suggest some books, since you are a perfect blend of a clinician and a lab person. So any books you can suggest to read for clinicians so that they can understand embryology better?
Well, actually, all of the books that I have written are understandable by clinicians. Definitely. But I know that there are a lot of textbooks now. There's so many textbooks that are multi-author books with lots of different textbooks. I mean, there's lots of textbooks of IVF that are written for clinicians also, but they tend to be lots of different chapters written by different people.
I, I think Sanjay also has a question.
Yeah.
Shukla, Dr. Sanjay Shukla.
Yeah.
He's raised his hand. Yeah, you can unmute yourself and yeah, you can unmute yourself, Dr. Sanjay.
So,
Okay, till he comes. Yeah, good.
uh,
I think that's
okay, there is one more question from your student, a student from Leeds, Nishad. He wanted to know a bit more about your experience in teaching at Leeds, apart from Bourne Hall. How was it?
In teaching in Leeds, apart from, well, yeah, to begin with, I was very involved in the first couple of years when it was just initial, but then after that, I was really just traveling up to give one lecture a year. In the first couple of years, actually, the students also came down to Bourne Hall for a whole day of teaching, but it turned out to be not cost effective. It cost too much money, so then I just started traveling up, and I usually give just 2 lectures during the year. So I don't really get to know the students anymore as I did in the first few years. I got to know all the students very well.
okay. I think, Manisha, we need to wind up. I think after Dr. Sanjay's question. Yeah, Dr. Sanjay.
Your views about ultra vitrification and so many things. So, if time permits, can we
Yeah,
take
otherwise,
more?
I think we have overshot quite a lot. Maybe Dr. Sanjay, and then we can wind up because it's getting quite late here. Yeah. Yeah, Sanjay, you can unmute yourself. Oops, you can't.
Ma'am, can you?
Okay. You can
All
go.
right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Uh,
Thank you. So
Yeah.
probably you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
It was such a nostalgic listening to you, Dr. Kelder. And I can say the first three books that I was the proud owner of were written by you. So, and how I ventured into embryology, learning from your books. So, uh, when we were discussing about this troubleshooting uh, compiled book, um, I do have one copy of it, a hard copy. I do not know whether it is a copyright infringement, but if uh, it is okay, probably ACE can take initiative to republish it. Dr. Rajiv, what do you say?
If we have permission, because I may have a soft copy because we did print it about 10 years ago.
Yes.
Of course, a lot of things were of, we're talking of 2000, 2002.
Yeah.
But so if it's interesting and if maybe we can interact with her later because she
Yeah.
may need to get permissions. And if there are permissions, I think we can discuss it.
Yeah.
So
I think,
I'll search for the copy. Yeah.
the one that you reprinted,
Yeah.
Raj, I don't think there's any problems. The other ones, I think all of the Cambridge University Press ones are probably available as ebooks now, but
Mm.
it's quite a complicated system. It's not, you have to
Yeah.
have software to download, etc. I can't even access my own ebooks.
Yeah. No, this one weren't by Cambridge University Press. I'll look for it and then get back to you, UK, get a formal permission, and then we can someday take it forward.
Oh, no, but that one's still available. That one, I hope it's still available. I haven't checked, but
Okay.
it's still available from CUP. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can't
Okay.
thank. Okay. We can't thank you enough, Dr. K. Um, as we are nearing to the conclusion, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to you, ma'am, for sharing your remarkable journey and invaluable insight. A special thanks to Rajvi, ma'am, for conceptualizing and anchoring this conversation so eloquently. These moments will shape us, inspire us towards a brighter and more purposeful future. So now our president of our Academy of Clinical Embryologists India, Dr. Sujata Krishnamurthy is with Dr. Sujata Ramkrishnan ma'am is with us. I'm so sorry. So I'll like to invite her to formally express our gratitude. Over to you, ma'am.
We
Ma'am,
can't.
you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Dr. Manisha. Thank you all and very good evening. Thank you, Dr. K, for taking time to talk to us. And as Dr. Sanjay Shukla had mentioned, for many of us, it was just a nice trip down the memory lane. And for all the new embryologists, I'm sure it would have been very inspiring because it was an arduous journey. And what they have now is embryology simplified. And so I think they should channel all their energy, which was earlier used by stalwarts in creating things. They should now channel it towards fine-tuning embryology and then making it a safe subject. So with this, I would like to thank you and thank you, Dr. Rajvi. And before I forget, I just also want to mention one thing about Dr. K's course. You know, those days when we hear about people attending this MSc embryology course, we all used to actually earningly think whether if we'll get an opportunity to attend, because more than learning embryology, we knew that each module was conducted in one European country. And that was something, you know, like it was very, very attractive. The whole thing seemed to be very attractive. However, thank you so much, Dr. K, for this time. And especially ACE started its academic venture of this year with such a nice presentation or a nice conversation. And I also would like to thank Dr. Rajvi for planning this conversation and also steering the discussion in such a way that it is interesting and it's also informative. Thank you, Manisha, for coordinating the whole program. And I thank all the audience who've been here attending this conversation. We look forward to have you people in some more such events in the days to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of you, and especially to Rajvi and the ACE committee for honoring me with this invitation. It's absolutely my pleasure. And I wish you all very best success and a very happy, peaceful, and healthy New Year.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Manisha, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you so much, ma'am. With that, we wrap up this inspiring, insightful dialogue, leaving us with much to reflect upon and to carry forward. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being with us. With all the regards and best wishes for a healthy, happy, and prosperous New Year. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.